Hello and welcome everybody. I have 2 o'clock by my watch. I like to keep things moving and started, so we'll go over the house rules real quick to give a few more people time to join. In the meantime, today, hopefully you can see my screen. We're talking to IBC, IEBC committee hearing. This is meeting agenda number 3 that's on the screen. A couple housekeeping items. We ask that you please do turn on your camera throughout the hearing. That way we have a more personable experience. Please ask that you mute unless you are speaking. Our note taker today is Charlie, and our subject matter expert is Shauna. So if you're not familiar with those names, you probably should be by now, but they are on the call with us today as well. We will have a timer in here when we get to the public comment section, so everybody know that there will be a timer on the screen. About halfway through the hearing here, we'll take a 5-10 minute break when there's an appropriate time for that. So real quick, for those of you who are not familiar, that are not part of the panelists are pretty familiar with this by now, but some of you might be joining from the general public that are not familiar with how we do these hearings. I'll just run through that real quick. We follow Robert's Rules of Order. So how that happens is the first thing is that the proposal is introduced by the moderator, which is myself. Then the proponent will give us a brief rundown of that proposal. And then we'll ask that the general public, anybody that wants to speak in support of that proposal, to raise their hand. They will have 2 minutes to speak their mind in support of the proposal. From there, we will go to anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of the proposal to raise their hand, and they will have 2 minutes each to speak in opposition of that. From there, we go back to the committee. I'll use the word committee and panelists interchangeably just because that's how Zoom calls people as the panelists, although we call it a committee. So from there, we go back to the committee and have them ask any questions of the proposal. Then we go back after all those questions from the panelists are done to the general public for any rebuttals in support or rebuttals in opposition. You'll have 1 minute to speak at that time. We then go back to the panelists for any motions, whether it's a modification or call for a vote or approval or anything like that. So those are the way that we are going to be following the items today. And I will say right now, real quick, if everybody can raise their hand, because that's how we vote and communicate, general public and panelists, please do so that we know that communication works for everybody. While you do that, I'm going to make Charlie a co-host in case I get disconnected for some reason. You all won't get kicked off.
Kevin, can you bring David Carnicelli over? He's showing up as an attendee, and I think he needs to be a panelist because I think he's on this committee.
Okay, great. Yep, all right, so let's see. I have, keep your hands up. I just want to make sure. I did see, I think I only saw Gary, if you can raise your hand. I don't know if you can raise your hand or not. Gary Moore. Keith, are you able to raise your hand? Keith's raising his hand. Gary, I still don't see that you're able to raise your hand. Gary, can you hear us? You're muted right now. See if you can unmute. Okay, I still don't. There we go. Okay, Gary raised his hand. All right, everybody feel free to lower your hands. And before we get started, I do see we have somebody in the chat. Okay, Shauna, we got that taken care of. We are going to start with item number 11. After we get this introduced, Charlie, I'll come back to you to do a roll call. That gives us a few minutes for everybody to continue to join in there. I do see 2 hands still up from the general public. If you do have a question, feel free to keep your hands up. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce us to the first item of business, and then we will go to you for a question there if you have a question. So first item is item number 11, and Alan, you are, I'm going to allow you to talk because this is your proposal. And will you give us a summary of your proposal while I bring it up?
Hi, Kevin, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I don't see a camera option on my end.
Sure.
Let me just check real quick.
No, I can. Let me move you over to a panelist, and then you can turn your camera on. It might be a lag there for a minute. Okay, while that's happening, Colleen, I see that you have your hand up. Do you have a question about the protocol or anything?
No, I apologize. I thought my hand was down.
Okay, great. All right, Alan, when you should be switched over. So when you are officially switched over, feel free to, there you are, give us a start.
Right here. Okay, I don't know if this wants to be addressed now or later. There's just a couple errata, Kevin, under where it says doorway door operations. It should say 403.5.3. A little bit further down, yeah, right there. And then further to the right, it says exit discharge doors. It should say exit discharge. Stairway door, it's right after right after that section to the right. Exit discharge, no D at the end of discharge. Okay, so this proposal, there are two proposals within the amendment. And this was intended to match the language for proposal 14, which tied into the relationship of the electric locks master switch into stairway locks operations. That's added as the last part of the amendment, the underlying portion. If you recall, 14 was approved, and so we're trying to match the same language for 43.53 for high-rise stairway lock and high-rise stairway doors. The second part is to try to clarify the requirements as to when doors are required to unlock simultaneously. I think the way it's written now, it reads, doors are required to unlock upon fire alarm or loss of power or signal from the fire command center, which could imply that the doors only need to lock on one of the three items, and that instead of requiring them to unlock on each of those scenarios, should any one of those happen. And so I think we changed the proposal is to strike or, to read it as fire alarm, loss of power. There probably should be and a signal from the fire command, or maybe just strike A. So loss of power, signal from fire command center, and activation of electric locks master switch. So that's the intent, is to clarify when doors need to unlock, that they're required on all three scenarios, and not just one of the three, or four rather in this case.
Okay, thank you, Alan, for the summary. We will just hold tight, general public, hold tight committee. We will come back to you, but we will go to the general public first. So general public, if anybody wants to speak in support of this proposal, please raise your hand. You see a hand. Mark, you will have 2 minutes. Please introduce yourself while I bring a timer up.
Okay, thanks. This is Mark Jelinski. I am a registered professional fire protection engineer, mechanical engineer, seal lots of projects within the city and county of Denver. I'd like you to make sure that as we go through this, and there's a couple other ones, there's one on chapter 10, talks about door locking arrangements, that the provisions for door locking arrangements within NFPA 101, chapter 18, regarding healthcare, and in particular, the type of units where the clinical needs of the patient require door locking are met. That provision within NFPA 101, chapter 18, does indeed allow for door locking arrangements without a power outage or without a fire alarm activation, because of the nature of the patients, typically behavioral health or Alzheimer's dementia units. This is used for. By the way, this is not the same provision that's used for LDR, labor delivery, newborn safety. Those units do indeed require operation of the doors or unlocking of the doors with fire alarm. This is primarily for the security risk patients. And again, clearly delineated in NFPA 101 18.2.2.6. Thank you. And by the way, I know we've dealt with this before. We usually have to have a discussion about this. So I accept an option here is to just recognize that and deal with it via administrative procedures. So thank you for that consideration.
All right, thank you, Mark. Anybody else from the general public that would like to speak in support of this, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support of this, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, we'll ask it the opposite. Anybody in opposition from the general public that wants to speak, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody that wants to speak in opposition of this, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, we will go back to the committee. Committee, this is your time to ask questions and questions only to the proponent. So if you have any comments or ideas or anything like that, please hold tight on those. This is a question time only. Steve, your hand's up first.
Yes, Alan, based on your revisions, are you suggesting that you want all four, fire alarm, loss of power, signal from the fire command, and the activation of the master switch to unlatch the doors, or just one of those four, any of those four?
Hi, Steve. Yeah, it can read confusing. It can read that all four are required. The intent is that any one of those events unlocks the doors.
All right, thanks.
Next up, we have David.
Alan, so the way this reads now, there's a signal from the fire command center and the activation of electric locks master switch. In the last hearing, we passed through the definition of what an electric locks master switch is, which includes that it's always in the fire command center if there's one present, which there will be for this provision because it's a high rise. So is it fair to say that those two items are actually the same item?
Yeah, I would agree, Dave, that that's the case. The only small hesitation is that the next proposal has it's a proposal to tie in buildings between 4 and 7 floors. So wasn't sure if I would suppose a fire alarm command center would be required in those buildings as well, but I'm not 100% sure. And so I left it separate in the event that there isn't a fire alarm panel in certain conditions. But I would agree that for high rise that they are one and the same.
Thank you.
All right, committee, any other questions for the proponent? I'll ask one final time, any final questions for the proponent? Okay, seeing none, we will go back to the general public for any rebuttals. Mark, do you want to speak in a rebuttal for this, or anybody else from the general public in support? Please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, we will go back to the panelists, the committee there. Committee, this is now your time to have discussion, comments, questions, concerns, whatever. This is an open scenario right now. First hand I see go up is Keith. Keith, go ahead.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me. The English language is tough for me, being an engineer, but the way I read this now is that there's two things that have to happen. Any one of the first group and activation of the switch. And so, Alan, what I heard you say many times when you were making your presentation, you use the word any. And I'm wondering if you would consider changing the wording a bit and say that it shall lock on simultaneously without unlatching upon any of the following. And then you don't, I don't know how you add that last component there without the word and, but at least it says up front, any of the following. And so that's, I don't know if that's a comment or something that I'll propose as a modification, but thank you.
Great, thanks, Keith. Next hand is Steve Thomas.
Yeah, I agree with Keith. I think the way the language is proposed creates confusion. I would sort of the same way that Keith is talking about it. I would actually keep, well, first of all, let me talk about David's comment that I agree it's redundant and I don't think you really need it at all. But if we keep it in there, then I think you need to maintain the words or to make and then at the last one where it says Fire Command Center, change that word and or, so that if it's any of those, it unlocks the doors. The way it reads right now and the way the code is written, when you see the word and in there, that means all of those have to happen to unlock those doors, not just one of them. When you have or in there and just having or in each one of those just confirms that and clarifies it so that any of those four things happen, the doors unlock. So if we're going to maintain it, and like I said, I'm not sure we need it at all based on David's comment, but if we're going to keep it in there, then I would recommend we modify the proposal and put the ors back in and change and to or between Fire Command Center and activation of electric locks.
Okay, next hand up is, a couple of hands go up and down. Keith.
Well, the problem I see with using or, and maybe this is what Alan was thinking about, is does that mean that the building owner gets to pick which of those four it's going to unlock? I mean, you can do it this way, or you can do it that way, or you can do it the third way, and that's the other side of the coin.
What if we did any of the following and then just did the 4 bullets below it? Just like a list below.
I think it accomplishes the same thing. I mean, the or is very similar to things like we have for, and actually, Julie, your suggestion is the same thing we have for delayed egress, special locking devices, mag locks, all those kind of things. So that might be the better way to do it.
Okay, next hand I see is David.
Yeah, let me offer a little history on this. In our 2016 amendments to the 2015 code, we had Appendix Q for access control that had a very similar provision to it. But when it was carried over and we incorporated into the code, we missed carrying over a sentence, I believe, and I think that's what Alan is trying to address here. It used to say, it used to have all the ors in there like is written, but then after it said electric, or it said the electrically modified lock set shall be wired to all three of these monitor/power/control points, with the intent that you're requiring this to be connected to all of these different points, and any one of those three could unlock the doors. So that may be a solution here, that we keep the ors, that's the way it used to be, but add another sentence just requiring you have to connect to all these points. Otherwise, there's no real requirement to even connect it to the master switch. If you don't have one, or don't connect to it, that's fine. You'd unlock on fire alarm and loss of power only. But that, I think, is what he was trying to address, that we really want it connected to all of these three points, assuming these last two are really combined. The fire command center and electric locks are the same thing.
Okay, thanks, David. So just to recap, it sounds like there's two major items out there that are of concern. One is that this is a repetitive item, a repetitive proposal, I should say. And then the second, which had the most comments, is that the wording or layout of those four items on there. So just kind of a recap there. I don't see any more hands are up. So start to think about, or somebody go ahead, if you want to make a modification, or a suggestion, feel free to do so. Raise your hand. Shauna, go ahead.
Just throwing this out there, wondering if it would make sense to hear the next item, because if the next item doesn't go through, then there's no problem getting rid of signal from the fire command center. He wants to leave it in there just in case the next one passes. And so just curious if that would be an option or needed.
Sure. And there's always option to hear multiple proposals at the same time. We would just need somebody from the committee to propose that, and we can vote real quick on that and see. Next one up. Thanks, Shauna, as the subject matter expert on that. I appreciate that. Next hand is Steve.
2 seconds here. So I just put into chat maybe some language we might want to look at as an amendment to kind of go with Keith and Julie's suggestion that I very quickly pulled from another section of the code. That actually, I already think what you want is covered in 1010, but we want to be specific, we can.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Committee can look that over. Next hand up is Robert.
I just had a quick question. The reference to section 1023.92 of the IBC, should that reference 1023.92 of the Denver Building Code Amendments? And also maybe an edit on some of the wording. Stairway side shall be capable of being unlocked simultaneously. Any thoughts?
Okay. So if you're, you can make a proposal or proposed amendment to fix that editing there if we think that that's better. I think if it's the IBC versus the Denver DBC, then I think that's just clerical, and we can update that. Next hand is David.
Yeah, I just wanted to address that, the comment about referencing the IBC versus the Denver Building Code. I believe we have language in there that says, any references to the main code is intended to be as amended by Denver. So I think we're good there. And I was going to make a motion, but I see Keith's hand up, so maybe I'll see what he has to say first.
Hi, yeah, I like Steve's idea. It's a few more words, but it clearly indicates you need to do all of those things. But the thing that I think that's missing is it in our current amendment, it says unlock but remain latched because it's a fire door. And that but remain unlatched, or whatever the wording is, that maybe that phrase, I would recommend that phrase, I support Steve's idea, but I think we had to add the phrase under each of those 3 bullet items that it's the doors to remain latched. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody want to make a motion here? David, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll make a motion to approve with the intent to modify.
Second.
Okay, and what's the modification?
I'm going to do 2 modifications. Maybe you'll take them one at a time. The first one would be to put the oars back in. So that first oar would still be there. The second oar would still be there. And then to combine these last 2, it would say or replace the A with an. To be an electric locks master switch signal. No, now that stays there, or that's going to be stricken. I want that moved over and to be in front of signal. This is matching what we did in the last hearing.
So I'm on the wrong side. Are we talking on this
Right
side
there.
then?
Yeah, change that.
Okay.
Instead of A, that would be an. Electric locks master switch. Signal from the fire command center, period, and you'd strike the rest of it.
Okay. Is that the first one? Or you have another one, David? Or is that both of them combined?
That's the first one. And I don't know if we want to discuss and maybe vote on the first one before going on to the second one.
Okay. Because we can do all of them together. So if you feel like maybe the second one's a little bit more.
Okay. Well, we can add the second one in here and then we can modify it.
Okay.
So this first change basically got it back to where it was, except it added in that electronic locks master switch definition. Then to clarify, we want it to be connected to all of these points. We would add one more sentence at the end that says, let's see, just say the lock set shall be wired to all 3 of these monitor / power / control points. That's just taking wording from our old appendix Q.
Did I capture that correctly?
Yep, except yeah, none of it's in italics, but
Okay. Okay. Here we go. All right. Cool. Anything else, David?
just to clarify it, the electric locks master switch should be in italics and have a dash between locks and master, just to match the defined term.
Great. Steve Thomas, you seconded David's motion. Are you good with these? Since
Yes.
now
I
that
think they're
they've been
fine.
made. Okay,
Yep.
great. Okay. So next up, we have a motion and a second, but we have more hands up. David C., your hand's up.
So this is a question based on Alan's comments and the next proposal. Is it possible that there are conditions where there is an electric locks master switch that's not in a fire command center? And does this change eliminate that as a possibility? So in a non-high-rise building greater than 4 stories, there might not be a fire command center, but this change has said that the signal comes from the fire command center.
Valid question. Anybody want to jump in and answer that question?
I just want to say I have the same concern. I don't want to all of a sudden require a fire command center in a building that's not a high rise just because they have electric stair locks. I mean, so.
Okay.
I'll jump in and, that will become an issue if we approve the next proposal. With that consideration, I believe our definition of electric locks master switch, I can't remember what we approved last time. We might have taken out the location part of that. I have to look back, see what we did at the last hearing. It used to say that it had the location. It was in the fire command center or near the door if there's none present. I don't remember. I think we might have taken that wording out of the definition though.
Well, except now it says electric locks master switch signal from the fire command center.
Right, but if our definition doesn't say that and we take it out of here, there's no location requirement anymore for it, for the high rise. And it has to be really in the fire command center.
My notes show that we took out the italicized words that say typically, but not limited to, delayed egress doors, and that we also took out the sentence, the switch shall be located in the building's fire command center or other approved location. That we did take out that sentence. That's what my notes say, but we heard it 2 different times, right? We heard it and then we tabled it to go with all the other ones, and then we heard it again. But that's what I'm showing.
Thank you. For the sake of moving on, Steve, your hand's up next.
So I think each item should be considered on their own. And when we get to the next item, there's nothing that says we can't make modifications to that to address the concerns and make sure that we say the language is consistent between the 2 sections. I'd say let's fix that. Let's not worry about that item. If this passes, then we can fix it, the next one, to address our concerns there.
Okay. Next hand up is Robert.
Sorry, can't hit the right button. What if after fire command center, we just put or approved location? Because the next proposal, I think, specifies this section specifically, that it has to meet it. I could be wrong.
Okay, so that's a suggestion to David, who had made the modification. You don't have to, just a suggestion.
Yeah, I'm not going to support that because this section is specific to high rises, which will always have a fire command center, and that's where we want the switch located.
Okay. Any other discussions from the panel before we call a vote? Don't see any. Robert, I want to put your hand down. Okay, so I'll call a vote, but before we do that, we have to do a roll call. Make sure we have quorum, which I believe we do. Make sure we're not missing anybody that needs to be missed and get a count. So Charlie, go ahead and take it over.
Yes, thanks, Kevin. So I only see 2 committee members that are not accounted for, being Brian Parr and Yvette Roman. If you are present, you can just raise your hand just to confirm. But also, it's important to mention that I do have 2 committee members present that are being marked on the list as having 1 vote, being Gary Moore and Robert Pruitt. So we have 14 members present, but it appears that there's going to be 13 votes.
Okay, so 13 votes. Okay, all right, thank you. So with that being said,
can you just clarify which one of them is going to do the voting so that you know which one to look for? Who's voting, Gary or Robert?
Like Gary, he rose his hand. All right, so the first, well, I guess let me back up. So the motion was to pass with the intent to modify, and the modifications are on the screen. So I believe since the motion was to pass with the modifications, it's a 1 vote, not an individual vote on the modifications and then a vote on passing it. So just keep that in mind. We're voting on passing it with the modifications that were made. So that's what we'll be voting on. All those in favor of passing this with the modifications that are listed on the screen, and those that are highlighted here, and pardon me on the colors, it's either a purple or a bluish color, please raise your hand. All those in favor. I have 13. All right, it's unanimous. Go ahead and lower your hands. All right, so that passes. So let me hit save to make sure we capture that. Okay, so the next item on our list, before we get to the next item, there is another housekeeping item that I forgot to mention. A couple hearings ago, in one of the past hearings, you all have heard a proposal 79A, and that had to do with indoor environmental quality for VOC materials. That was rejected, and I'll remind you, it was rejected 11-0 to 2. And I believe that was, a lot of that was due to unclear on why such big sections were taken out. There's just a lot of unclarity there. I want to update you all as a committee that the residential code hearing did pass that. So even though you all rejected it for this part of the code, the residential code did pass that. The city would like to know if you all want to rehear that, because there was modifications, since there was some confusion and things, that proposal was modified in that hearing. So what I'll do is I'll call a vote to see if the majority of you want to rehear that, reopen that up or not. That's what we're going to vote on. But I just wanted to bring that up, that you guys did reject it, the reason why you rejected it, the vote count, and then also it had passed in a different committee with some modifications. So that's just a housekeeping thing I wanted to bring up. So all those in favor of reopening and hearing that item 79A at a later code hearing, you would have the opportunity to review it and everything. Please raise your hand. Okay, I see 9. Go ahead and lower your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. I see 3, and all of those, go ahead and lower your hands. Sorry. And all those abstaining, please raise your hand. All right, cool. Well, hopefully that gives some clarification maybe on the next ones. We'll see, maybe not. You could. I'm glad that you guys are open to hearing that again. All right, next item of business is item 24. Alan, I believe that's yours again. So when I pull it up, go ahead and give us a summary.
Okay, I do have a couple of errata items, Kevin, but I can go back on those after you pull it up. So this amendment seeks to clarify the door unlocking requirements for non-high-rise buildings greater than 4 stories. Currently, 1010.2.7 only requires that doors in these types of buildings to unlock upon signal from the fire command center or signal by, well, the section we amended out to read electric locks master switch. Previous language in the 2016 DBCA Appendix Q also required that doors in non-high-rise buildings greater than 4 stories meet the high-rise requirements, and it was not our intent to eliminate that that requirement. So, by adding exception 6 or adding, let's see, exception 6, we would require these doors in buildings greater than 4 stories to meet the requirements of IBC 403.5.3, which we just amended to meet those requirements. The errata, Kevin, is under add new text as follows. There's an extra 1 after 1010, so it should read 1010, not 1010.01. And then after that, it should be amended by adding item 6. I'm not sure, that's an old carryover text from another amendment. So it's amended by adding item 6.
Okay. Great. I think I captured those. Thank you. Committee, hold tight. We'll go to the general public. General public, anybody that wants to speak in support of this proposal, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support of this, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. Seeing none, we'll go to opposition. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this proposal, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Seeing none, I'll go back to the committee. Committee, this is your time to ask questions and questions only to the proponent. Keith, your hand's up first.
Hi, how is item 6 different from exception item 2? I mean, I think that exception item 2 applies to buildings of all heights, all numbers of stories.
Well, I think, so are you talking about actually item 3?
It says,
okay.
Exception 2, this section, shall not apply. I apologize. Okay, I read that wrong. I was reading it shall apply to doors. Okay, never mind. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from the committee? Next hand is Stephen.
Yes, my question for the proponent, when we look at exception 6 that's being proposed and it references 403.5.3? Is the intent that it references only that section, or would the next section 403.5.3.1 also be required, since that's listed under the section of 403.5.3, which would require stairway communication system?
Yeah, the intent would be to include that section, Steve.
So you would be requiring stairway communication? Is there any other requirements? I'll, in the form of a question, I guess, but my concern is that this triggers other requirements for a non-high-rise building that would be under 403.5. Because we're going to include communications. Where does that stop?
The intent of this section is to bring the requirements for stairway doors over 4 stories to meet the high-rise requirements for unlocking. And that would include the two-way communication and signage.
How about any other high-rise requirements?
The intent was to keep it just to the stairway door unlocking requirements.
I'm asking only because we'll be asked. So I read it that we can lock these doors in the 4-story to 7-story. But part of the justification in being able to do this in a high-rise building is all the other stuff that's in a high-rise building. So we're saying we can lock the doors and put a communication system in and do it from 4 to 7 stories, and that's okay. Is that correct?
That's the proposal to meet the locking requirements, but not necessarily all the requirements for a high-rise interior exit stairway. So if you're like implying that would smoke control be, required? No, I think it's strictly to the locking, and to make it, it just becomes more restrictive than what the code says now, but it aligns with what we previously required in Appendix Q.
Okay, next question comes from Julie.
Alan, I'm just wondering about the 4-story requirement. If it's like a podium building, say it's 2 stories of podium with a horizontal separation, 3 stories on top, you could consider that like a 2-story and a 3-story building. Do we want to say 4 stories above grade to be very clear that anything 4 stories above grade is going to need this or can use this?
Yeah, I would be open to that, Julie. I think that's a good clarification to get into the proposed amendment.
Great. Any other questions from the committee members? Third and final call, questions from the committee. I see a couple more hands go up. Steve, you're up first.
So Alan, if we look at exception number 3, that applies to all buildings. If we were to amend that, modify that to include the language that we just put in 403.5.3 regarding fire alarm, loss of power, signal for fire command if present, or activation electric locks, master switch, would that resolve the issue that you have?
Yeah, I think it could, Steve, if the clarification for, it sounds like you're proposing to combine or add language from 6 into 3 and eliminate 6.
Right.
Not mistaken.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a possibility, and I'd be fine with that.
Great, thanks.
A bunch of hands went down. I guess they all had the same comments, which I appreciate, because there's no need to reiterate the same thing on there. So thank you for that. Okay, so that's it. Oh, sorry, Keith, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm having such a hard time with this, but exception number 3 doesn't require unlocking to occur upon, does it? Oh, fire signal from fire alarm center, not loss of power. I think.
Right, and what I'm proposing is that we add loss of power, signal from the fire command center, or activation of electric locks master switch.
Okay, thank
In
you.
fact, it's in chat now if you want to see the language.
Okay, any other questions at this time? This is questions only from the committee. Seeing no more hands, we'll now move it to the open discussion portion for the committee. So it sounds like Steve might want to make a motion here to amend. Steve, go ahead.
So I'd like to make a motion to modify, approved as modified by the language that I put into chat to replace exception number 3 and delete the proposed language in exception 6.
Did I capture that
Looks like it.
correctly? Okay. All right. So there's a motion on the table. Still opportunity to have discussion and or a second. I did see a hand go up. David C., go ahead. David, I don't know if you had a question or not, but you are muted.
Sorry, I was double muted. I was saying I'll second that.
Okay, so there was a second. All right. Any other discussion? Okay. Oh, David R., go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, I mean, I kind of like where this is going, but I think it may be too restrictive. There's no height limit on this change anymore. So this would apply to a 2-story building, a stair enclosure in a 2-story building that we need all 3 of these points. Although actually, aside from that, it actually has the same problem as we had with the last one. It doesn't require connection to all 3 of these points. So you don't need that master switch, and you don't necessarily need it. It doesn't require you to have it. If you have it, it unlocks on it, but it doesn't require you to have it. So I think there's some issues with trying to combine this. And just as a, well, it's related to this. I quite frankly, I think that if this doesn't pass, I'll probably move to disapprove. I don't know that this is needed. We had our previous amendment was, or Appendix Q kind of stood alone, and all these exceptions were deleted from the code. We've now put these back in. So for these buildings that are 4 stories or greater, but less than a high rise, we do pick up exception 3 now that requires this signal from the fire command center or single location inside the main entrance for basically all buildings up to a high rise now that we didn't have before. So we do have that. It wouldn't have the loss of power, but or a fire alarm, but it is something that we've added back into the code that we didn't have in Appendix Q. And for less than a high rise, I personally think that is adequate the way the code is written. So.
Okay. Any other discussion from the committee before we vote? Steve, go ahead.
Real quick, just to kind of comment on David, I tend to agree if you wanted to go disapproval. My understanding of the elimination of Appendix Q was because much of the language that was in Appendix Q was covered in the base code itself. And I think if we look at section 1010.2, 11, 12, 13, all of those kind of things, they all have very similar language as far as being unlocked due to loss of power, fire alarm, switch from the command center. It just depends on what kind of lock that you use. And so, especially, electrically locked egress doors. So I think you could argue that. So I could either go with what we've done, and I wouldn't have a problem making an amendment to say something about 4 stories, but then we lose what we had in this is the problem with writing code on the floor. That, it would apply to all buildings in this case, including a 2-story building.
Okay, so it sounds like the motion to modify, to approve with the modification by deleting item number 6 is still, could go either way. It sounds like Steve is, if I'm hearing that correctly, that he could go either way on that. David C., you're up next.
Just kind of a related question. So all Steve did with this was add the ability to unlock with the electric locks master switch, right, to language that was already there in 3, and it's an or, right? So if the electric locks master switch is present, then that's a valid means of unlocking all the doors. Or am I not understanding it?
That's how I would read it.
Okay, next up, David R.
Yeah, I actually read it a little differently in that the way the code reads now for exception 3, it requires a signal from the fire command center if present, or a signal from emergency personnel, single location. I guess we modified it in the last time to change the wording of that to electric locks. So it currently requires that. By changing this to any 3 of these with ORs in, you don't need that anymore. You hook the fire alarm if you have it. Loss of power would always apply. You hook to the master switch if you have it, but it doesn't require it anymore for any height of building.
Would it help if we change the ORs to and? I don't think that does it either.
Yeah, we just shot that down on the last one. It's the same
Right.
thing.
I'm just trying to figure out, trying to fix the change.
Okay, keep thinking about that. Next hand is Paul.
Yeah, I guess I'm struggling to understand how the height comes into play here. So item 3 is just an exception to keeping the doors unlocked. So all it's saying is if you want to lock the doors, here's how you can do it, correct?
Correct.
So is the intent then that if you have a building up to 4 stories, you'd be able to lock the doors regardless?
As long as the doors would unlock upon a signal from the fire alarm, loss of power, fire command center, activation electric locks master.
Well, my question was for buildings up to 4 stories.
Yeah, this would be any building.
Right.
Right, up to a high rise. So 2 stories up to a high rise, as David said earlier.
Right. So I'm wondering what the concern is about losing the height limit.
That I can't answer.
My concern, without the height limit, we are now making exception 3 more stringent for 2, 3, and 4-story buildings. I think, well, if you assume you have to hook to all 3 of those points. If you don't assume that, we're making it less stringent because you could just have loss of power. It doesn't say you have to have that master switch. Loss of power could be the only thing that really applies. Whereas the base code would require the signal from the fire command center or location by the entrance, so. And just reiterate Steve's comment earlier, this is the problem with writing it on the fly. It's
It
tough. It's tough.
I tried.
I appreciate it, but it's tough.
I could withdraw my motion and then just support your disapproval.
No, we can vote on it.
Okay, well, I do like to have a vote on this, but I also like to be able to make sure that everybody's voice gets heard. And if the intent is there and everybody can agree on the intent, we can have a ad hoc group get together and, you know, write it a little bit cleaner, but yet still the intent is there. So just keep that in mind. We can do that if the group wants to vote on the intent with an ad hoc group to kind of finalize how it's supposed to be written. We can do that. So, but Steve and David C., since this is your motion and your second, if that's the route we want to go, we would have to change that. Otherwise, we'll call a vote for your approval with these modifications.
Yeah, I would prefer to take a vote based on my understanding of what happened with the last ad hoc committee we put together, so.
Okay. And David, would you remove your second then, or update your second for that? David C.
I'll keep the second.
Okay. So, so the motion on the table. So, Steve, let's have you explain the intent of your motion so that the committee can vote on having an ad hoc write that a little bit better in terms of, all right, here's the intent. We want it to be, you know, all buildings from 0 stories to high rise. Is that the intent, or do you want to get rid of, you know, I think that's what you're talking about, getting rid of number 6. We can
No,
vote on that.
I'm saying no to an ad hoc committee.
Oh, you're saying no to, okay, gotcha, understood. I misunderstood, sorry, okay. Okay, all right, so I will call a vote then. The vote is to approve as amended on the screen. So that's what we're voting on. Again, it won't be 2 separate votes because the motion was to approve with these modifications on there. So all those in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, I see a couple of hands still going up. I see 3. Okay, go ahead and lower your hands. I'm going to lower yours. Okay, all those who disapprove, please raise your hand.
I was disapproving, just so you know.
Steve, hold on 1 second.
I raised my hand too quick. I'm voting against the motion. My own motion.
Okay, so I'll take a, okay.
Sorry for the
So there was
confusion.
2 there. Understood. 2 for approval, 9 for disapproval. Go ahead and lower your hands. And all those abstaining, please raise your hand. One. Okay. Go ahead and lower your. So this was this proposal has been rejected 2 to 9 to 1.
Okay, don't we still need a motion for disapproval of the whole thing?
Well, that's what we were voting on since the motion was to approve with the modifications. You've all just voted to disapprove the entire proposal with the modifications.
Okay.
Why would that be?
David, your hand.
Why would, there's always another motion, right?
Yeah, I
So
wonder-
if you do a motion for as modified and it fails, you still have a motion for disapproval, a motion for as submitted.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Sean. David, go ahead.
I want to make a motion to disapprove.
Second.
Who was the second? Was that you, Steve?
Yes.
Okay, great. Any other discussion?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things. Like I mentioned before, I think the existing exception 3 is adequate for less than a high rise. It is, might be a little less stringent than we used to have for a 5-story building that's not a high rise, but that's really what we're looking at, 5, 6-story building. That's it. But I think we're adequate. The base code's adequate for that. The other problem I have with this is the way it's written. This section says, doors shall be openable from both sides without the use of a key or special knowledge. And then this exception 6 says stairway exit doors for non-high-rise buildings greater than 4 stories shall meet the specific requirements of 40353. Just kind of weird to have an exception that you shall do something, but and if you do that, you go to that section, and then that section says you're permitted to lock them in a certain way. So we're putting a shall statement to a section that's as a permitted type thing, and then you choose not to do that, and you're left with no requirement at all. So if you can follow that logic, if I choose that exception that I have to follow 40353, and that section it just permits you to lock it under certain conditions. I don't have to do it, it's just permitted. Now I've lost the base requirement in 1010.2.7. So it's just kind of written a little strange for an exception, I think. So.
Okay, any other discussion? Charlie, I see your hand up.
I just wanted to quickly point out that it appears Gary Moore is no longer on the call. However, Robert still is, so I'm not sure if he's allowed to sub in for Gary, but I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, thank you. Okay, seeing no other discussion, we will call a vote to disapprove this proposal. All those in favor of disapproval, please raise your hand. Okay, I see 12. Go ahead and lower your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. Any, and all those abstaining, please raise your hand. 1. Okay, go ahead and lower your hands. So this proposal was disapproved. And so we'll move to the next one. I believe that is item 23, which is, I believe, Michaela. Michaela on. Don't see
it's mine.
that right. Oh, it's yours?
Yeah.
23. Okay, sorry about that. My notes were off. Maybe she's the next one or something. Okay, go ahead, David. Give us a summary while I pull it up.
And David Wren, City and County of Denver, representing the City Development Services on this one. So this one is for the change of occupancy provisions in the existing building code. There's a provision in the residential code now that says if you change an occupancy from an IRC building to an occupancy that falls out of the scope of the IRC, you have to go to the IEBC and comply with the change of occupancy provisions in the IEBC. Then you get to the IEBC and there's a bunch of provisions based on hazard category tables that are based on occupancy groups. The problem is if you, so you have an existing occupancy group and you have a proposed occupancy group and you see if you go higher or lower. Well, if you're moving from an IRC structure that doesn't have occupancy groups, it raises the question of what do you do with that? Where does that fall in those hazard categories? Because IRC structures aren't in there. They don't have an occupancy group. so that's what this proposal is intended to address. Basically saying that if you were permitted under the IRC, you'd consider it the existing occupancy to be a group R3 occupancy, which is kind of the corresponding group in the building code. So that's the proposal. I did have some feedback before this that we may want to consider as some changes. As written, there's a little bit of issue with this because it says structures most recently permitted under the provisions of the IRC. Well, the IRC didn't always exist. So if you get an older building, like before 2004, it was permitted under a different code, not the IRC. So to capture that, and we can get to committee, we can write it down, but there's essentially the wording I think could be changed to, for the purposes of this code, structures that are currently under the scope of the International Residential Code shall be considered to have an existing occupancy classification of group R3. So we base it on the scope rather than whether it was permitted under the IRC. And that's all I had.
Okay, thanks, David. We will open it up to the general public. General public, anybody wants to speak in support of this, please raise your hand. I see Mark. Mark, go ahead. You'll have, you're gonna remind us where you're from, and you'll have 2 minutes to speak. Mark, are you there?
Trying to be. Can you guys hear me?
There you are. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so my question about this one is, I feel like since we're kind of taking a blanket on the residential code and classifying everything as R3, we're creating a bit of a hole. Although there are structures that could be considered an R3, that occupancy, that classification of the occupants in it, are they, the nature of them, are they transient, are they permanent, has considerations in fire. So I think the issue is when we say we're just going to be an R3 structure and we go to the IEBC, we miss the potential provisions for specific fire requirements when you have those transient occupants. You also maybe create a situation where you could create a structure, say a hotel, built to the residential code that doesn't have any fire egress, doesn't have the right fire egress provisions that are required in the building code. So although I understand this is important to get this occupancy classification changed, like maybe we need to make a step before we go to the IEBC and hit the IBC to identify classification before we go to the IEBC. I was trying to look to the IEBC and see if there was a way that we could work it within that structure. But really those definitions of the R's, R1, 2, 3, and 4, have the best definition in the International Building Code. Thanks.
Okay, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support, it's your second call. Anybody that wants to speak from the general public, support. All right, all those from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Daniel, I'll allow you to talk. Please introduce yourself and you'll have 2 minutes.
Daniel Kraus, I'm senior architect for CPD doing architectural plan review. And my specific concern would be the application of table 1011.6, which deals with the exterior walls and opening protectives because they're very, very different for commercial buildings and for residential buildings. And a similar concern as what we just heard is that allowing a residence to be built and then reclassified as an R3 would then allow it to move up to an R2 and R1, even many other occupancies and assembly, frankly, is in the same tier with regard to its proximity to other structures. And we know the residences in Denver are proximate to other, single family residences, are very close to other structures and with very little protection. And there are many that people want to turn into. I've seen projects come in where they want to turn into a youth hostel, want to turn it into a bar, and that might not be appropriate to be able to apply that specific table of 1011.6 to allow that occupancy change from the residence to the bar or from the residence to the hotel.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Second call for anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this. And third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition. Okay, seeing no more, we will go back to the committee. Committee, this is your time for questions. Questions only. Anybody from the committee have a question? Steve, go ahead.
I wasn't going to talk on this one, but after the discussion, I went, oh, we didn't think of something. So David, if I have a townhouse with 3 or more units in it, would that then be classified as an R3 for the purpose of this section?
Yes.
Instead of an R2?
If it was a townhouse within the scope of the IRC, meaning not,
So if I was going to take a townhouse unit and change the occupancy, it would not be considered an R2? Because I have 3 or more units in the building?
not the way it's written here.
Okay. Is that your intent?
That is my intent. I think with the IRC separation requirements between the buildings, that's quite a bit different than an R2 that just has fire partitions. It behaves more like a single unit dwelling.
Gotcha. Great, thanks.
Next question comes from Tony.
Hey, good afternoon, Dave. Quick question, Tony from Denver Fire Department. So, right now we don't require fire sprinklers in IRC homes. When you migrate it to an R3, obviously IBC R3s would require fire sprinklers. What's your intent for the migration? To avoid fire sprinklers?
This proposal is just about the existing occupancy classification. So you can, so it only applies to a change of occupancy. So you'd be an R3 now and you're going to change to something else. So the sprinkler provisions would be based on what you're changing to, which will often be a higher hazard. If you put this in at an R3.
Right, but that assumes the occupancy you're migrating to has a higher threshold in Chapter 9. That may not necessarily be the case. So we'd end up with a non-compliant R3 by default.
No, I mean, like I said, this is the existing occupancy. You're only going to use this if you're changing to something else. So we'll be issuing a CO for something other than an R3. And we would have to meet whatever provisions are required for that new occupancy, not the existing.
Right, but couldn't I say I'm just converting from an IRC to an R3? And we've now accepted it as an R3?
I guess I've never seen someone apply to change to the building code just because. So, there's always a change of occupancy involved with that.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from the committee? Third and final call, any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none. Oh, Julie, I see your hand went up. Go ahead, Julie.
Sorry, that was a little slow. Dave, can you tell me how it happens now? Is it usually the architect that comes in and they just attempt to classify their existing building and they're usually looking at one of the Rs? How are they classifying the existing occupancy now when they're going to change the occupancy?
I think that case occurs where an architect may attempt to classify the existing condition. I think I've also heard interpretations that, okay, IRC structure is not in these tables, so you change to anything and it's a higher hazard category, no matter what you change it to. So I think there's a wide gamut of how this can play out right now. There's no specific guidance on it. And I don't necessarily agree that, just because IRC is not in the table, anything in the IBC is a higher hazard. That doesn't ring true to me. So.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Questions from the committee? Next up is Steve.
So David, first part says for the purposes of this code, but you're really only putting it in chapter 10. Would you be okay if we change code to chapter for the purposes of this chapter? Because otherwise it would apply to the other two options.
I'm not sure which option, what you're getting at, Steve. What options? This is specific
Well,
to
the
change
work
of
area, well, this is work area, but it would all if you say this code, then it would apply to the prescriptive option and the performance option, wouldn't it? Say this code.
It would. I don't know if the prescriptive option, if it matters really. You don't get these hazard category tables.
Right, and I agree.
I don't know.
I know what you're trying to do, and I like it. I think it's needed. I just want to be.
If you want to change it, I think that'd be fine because the net effect is 0. Maybe
right.
You think it's clearer. That's fine.
Okay.
Okay. Final call for questions from the committee. Any final questions? Okay, seeing none, we go back to the general public since there was a couple people that spoke, one in support, one in opposition. So general public, you'll have 1 minute to speak this time. Anybody from the general public that wants to have a rebuttal in support, please raise your hand. You see, I'll call a second time. Anybody from general public that want to speak in rebuttal support, please raise your hand. Third and final call, rebuttal and support from the
Kevin, I got my hand up since I was a proponent.
Okay, go ahead.
Is speaking on the general public side. I just want to address the comments.
David, then I'll limit you to 1 minute.
That's fine.
But then if you wanted to discuss it from a committee standpoint, you can do that in the next section.
I just wanted to talk about the issue with the exterior walls. I think it is a concern maybe that you're going from IRC to IBC that's more stringent on the exterior wall requirements. But if you're talking about, like Tony brought up before, just a change, let's say I wanted to change from an IRC to an IBC building, but we're not changing the use, it's a single family dwelling still. It's still the same hazard. I mean, just because we said it's a different code doesn't mean those exterior walls are more hazardous than they are now. So I think we're in okay shape with that. That's all.
Right, and you even did it in under a minute. All right, anybody else from the general public that wants to rebuttal and support? Seeing no more hands. Anybody from the general public that wants to have a rebuttal in opposition, please raise your hand. I see Daniel. Daniel, you will have 1 minute. Go ahead.
So with regard to what Dave just said, that a R could be built to the IBC and have the same single family, that's correct. But the table equates an IBC R to an IBC B or A or E educational or institutional occupancy. So even a hospital with regard to this exterior wall. The reason the code does that in the existing building code is because it assumes that we're dealing with buildings that are built to the commercial code. If we're looking at an existing non-commercial building that was not an R3, it was an IRC building, then it would not make that equation. It would not then say, well, you can have the same exterior wall and opening provisions. You can keep your exterior wall as it is and go to an hospital or go to a school or go to a bar or an auditorium or a hotel. I don't think it would do that. So true that an R3 is it can be an IBC building if it's built that way, and then it could be equated to other commercial uses with regard to the hazard at the exterior wall.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Anybody else from the general public that wants to speak rebuttal in opposition, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing no more, we'll go back to the panelists. Panelists, this is now your time for discussion or to make a motion. Anybody from the panel that wants to have any discussion or make a motion? Keith, go ahead. Keith, you are muted. Please unmute. Keith, you are muted. Keith, you are muted.
Sorry.
There you go.
I move for approval as amended by Dave Wren. I don't know that you wrote down what he was saying that he wanted to do. But I'm the person who put the bug in his ear, so I support that a modification. Thank you.
Can I ask, are you
Okay.
talking about the one where you put in the that are currently under the scope of the IRC, that amendment?
Yes. Yeah, the problem with the way it's currently written is what Dave said. If it wasn't recently permitted, that's the first problem, because we have some old homes that were maybe built in 1900. And they certainly weren't built under the provisions of the International Residential Code until after 2004. So then what do you do with all those, which may be the bulk of the ones that are undergoing a change of occupancy?
Okay, so Keith has made a motion to approve as amended, but I don't have any amendments. I know David spoke to those. So David, do you want, before we move to the next hand, do you want to speak to those?
Yeah, do you want to bring up the Word document so you can edit it?
Yes, I am currently working on that because I didn't get a Word version. So give me 1 second and it will come up. It makes it a lot more difficult if I'm trying to write a sticky note on the PDF. All right, it's loading. All right, I've created a Word document.
Okay, strike most recently permitted under the provisions. And replace that with that are currently under the scope.
Sorry, with the way that I did this, it's under the scope. It's not going to show on the screen there for some reason. However, okay, we got that. Is that it?
It should be under the scope of the.
Right. Yeah, I didn't strike of
It's not on the screen.
Oh, you didn't?
Yeah, it's not on the screen. Sorry.
Okay.
Just because I converted it from a PDF to a Word, there are some nuances there, so bear with that. Okay, so Keith, just to confirm, you're good with that. That was your motion.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
All right. Next hand is Robert. Go ahead, Robert.
I just wanted to second that.
Great. Okay. Any other discussions? Robert, I'm going to lower your hand. Okay. So I will call a vote to approve with this modification. You're voting to approve with this modification. All those in favor, please raise your hand. See hands going up. All right, I have 13, unanimous. Okay, go ahead and lower. All right, we're about halfway through, so we will take a break. I'll set a timer for 10 minutes on the screen, and when we come back, we will hear the next proposal. Feel free to turn off your cameras if you choose so, but we'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, if you can hear my voice, let's start making our way back. Okay, we are back from break. We'll give a few minutes for the people get back, but we are going to open up item P number 46, and that is Lori. Lori, I'm going to allow you to speak. And while I pull up your item, feel free to introduce yourself, Lori, and then give us a summary of your proposal, item number 46. Lori, are you there? Lori, I see that you might be trying to talk. Oh, there you are. Great.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Laurie Jessen with the City and County of Denver Architectural Plan Review. And I've got a proposal to add another function of space under business areas for lobbies, lounges, and I'd like to amend that to include collaboration spaces. The reason for this is as we see a lot more concentrated open office spaces, that there's a desire to have breakout spaces and lounge areas for the employees to get together and discuss work or otherwise. And also to provide a alternative occupant load for small waiting areas. So that's the reason.
Okay, thanks, Lori. Committee, hold tight. Oh, Shauna, do you have a question?
Yeah, so Lori, let me understand this. You said currently it says lobbies and lounges, and you want to add collaboration spaces or collaboration rooms?
Spaces.
Collaboration spaces. Okay, thank you. When I see something in the 2024 that deals with collaboration rooms that was proposed to be added, so I just want to make sure I look through that.
So Shauna is our subject matter expert for today, so that's why she was able to get that. She also knows a lot about the upcoming codes on the next code cycle. So committee, hold tight. We are going to go to the general public first. Anybody that wants to speak in support of this proposal from the general public, please raise your hand. Alan, I see your hand up. Alan, go ahead. You will have 2 minutes.
Thanks, Kevin. Alan, Yanong, City and County of Denver. I'd like to speak in support, I think maybe to the concept of lobbies and it's function of space is listed as lobbies and lounges. I think some internal discussions, we kind of honed in on waiting areas or lobbies for kind of your standard offices. And there's always a discrepancy as to what, we come to agreement there's an assembly function for this space, but the what occupant load factor are we going to be using for these spaces? And I think the exception to 1004.5 allows us to to make a determination of the occupant load for these spaces when it doesn't come out to what we're calculating. So one could argue that waiting room chairs only, you would use 7. That would result in a occupant of 71. 500 would at 15 for unconcentrated tables and chairs would be 33. And then I think the proposal, if applied at 30, would get it down to 17, which is closer to what we typically see here. We're either allowing them to count seats. And I think that the attempt for this proposal is to kind of put that number into the table. So, as a staff, we're consistent on what we're calculating for those types of spaces. Because when you start, if you really go by letter of code and say chairs only, and you have 71 in there, then you have egress problems, 2 means required. There's plumbing fixture considerations, and you start, really raising the occupant load. So to get to, an occupant load of 30, specifically, what I'm thinking of is these waiting rooms or lobbies of office spaces. I think it's a good idea.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. I'll stop your timer. The next up is Daniel. Daniel, go ahead. You'll have 2 minutes.
Thank you. I'm also an architectural plan reviewer for the city of Denver, and I'm also in support. I think this gives us a tool instead of using a bunch of workarounds to allow a more reasonable and realistic number of occupants in these types of spaces. It makes it much more straightforward. At the same time, if it's being abused and the space is indeed a dining area, an A2, something that's not a lounge in an office, or just has a really intense number of seat spaces and such, there is a section 1004.5.1 for increased occupant load. We can always tell the applicant that they've increased the occupant load from what is in the table. We can never, without an administrative modification to justify it, go less than the occupant load in the table. So by making the occupant load in the table 1 per 30, it allows us to use the table to have a more reasonable occupant load, but at the same time, where necessary, we can always enforce a higher occupant load if it is apparent that that's the case, that it will be used more intensely than the 1 per 30.
Okay, thank you. I'll stop your timer. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support, second call, raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support of this proposal, please raise your hand. Seeing none, we'll go to opposition. All those opposed to this, anybody that wants to speak in opposition of this proposal from the general public, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, we will go back to the committee now. Committee, any questions only at this time that you have of the proponent? Please raise your hand if you have a question for her. David, go ahead.
Laurie, I just have a question about the footnote D that you've put on here. So this line item is specifically under business areas, and then we have a footnote that says not associated with the group A occupancies. I'm just having a hard time envisioning a business area, lounge, or lobby that's associated with the group A. And so I'm not sure what that is or how you would enforce that.
What I had in mind with that is that if there were group A occupancies, large conference areas, that that this wouldn't apply, but we can revise this to say associated with group B occupancies. Would that resolve the issue?
No, because you're under the business occupancies. If we're not associated with them, it would
Okay.
never, it would never apply.
Well, can we strike it?
Maybe, we'll see.
Okay, so that was the question. Committee and Lori, keep that in mind as we move forward. But the next question comes from Julie.
It's kind of a similar question. I wanted to confirm that the intent is only for lobbies and lounges that are associated with a business occupancy. A good example would be a hotel lounge. So is it your intent to use 30 net for a hotel lounge as well, or is it your intent only for business, primary business occupancies?
At this point, it's only for business.
Okay.
All right, committee, any other questions? David, go ahead.
Sorry, just to follow up on that and clarify that a little further. Laurie, can you confirm that? So right now there's a line between this new added section and the concentrated business use areas. When this gets printed, that line should be taken out and both of those would be a kind of subset of business areas, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, Julie, your hand's still up. Did you have another question?
No, just a mistake, but thanks, Dave. That helps a lot, actually.
Okay. Third and final call for the committee on any questions. Okay, seeing none, we will go back to the general public for rebuttals. Since we did have a few people speak, anybody from the general public that wants to rebuttal and support, please raise your hand. You will have 1 minute. I do see a hand. Alan. Alan, go ahead. You'll have 1 minute.
Yeah, I think just to clarify the footnote D, what I think was the intent, and back to my association with lobbies, waiting rooms. Often you'll see in these collaboration spaces, these lobbies / lounges kind of mix into, they kind of combine and they form this large A occupancy. And so I think the intent was when those types of waiting spaces are adjacent to or part of a larger A occupancy, then they're not allowed to use the 30 net. That's my take. I don't know how the committee sees it, but that's just my opinion on the footnote. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else from the general public that wants to speak in a rebuttal and support? Daniel, you'll have 1 minute.
I just want to add to what Alan was saying that, starting this small, it is technically more lenient than the building code, because the building code might use a more restrictive 1 per 15. So to limit it to the business for now makes sense. Maybe this could be expanded one day, but and also potentially keeping the not associated with group A, where it could expand a true group A. So you have a cafeteria and then adjacent to it, there's kind of this collaboration and you're not sure how it's being used, but it certainly can expand the employee cafeteria. It might be wise to keep D. Maybe it needs a little bit of work to make it clear what the footnote is doing, but either way works, but to kind of start this slow and we can always expand it later.
Okay, thank you. Third and final call for rebuttals from the general public and support. Okay, seeing no more, we will turn it back over to the committee. Committee, this is your time to have discussion and or make a motion. The committee members want to, okay, there we go. We got some hands. Keith, go ahead.
Well, I have a question of Steve Thomas, perhaps. Shauna mentioned something about the 2024 I codes, and So I quickly tried to download the means of egress provisions and saw that there was a proposal for this. And Steve, maybe you were the sponsor or spoke for it. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. Maybe since your hand's up, you're planning to do that. But the other thing is I noticed that in NFPA 101, they have a similar idea that they call collaboration rooms, where they set an upper bound at 450 square feet. They allow you to use 30 square foot per person. And once you're larger than that, then you got to go to 15. And I'm a little uncomfortable with lobbies and lounges because traditionally those were denser occupant load in my world. Maybe a lobby was 1 per 7. So I'd kind of like to stay away from that word. But anyway, I suggested to Lori earlier today to use the term collaboration room because of what I saw in NFPA 101. Thanks.
Okay, next up is Steve.
Unmute. So first of all, to address Keith's question, there were 2 similar code changes submitted. E7 21 was submitted by Dave Frable. Used to be with, he's with the GSA, but wasn't representing them at this point, which tried to put in a definition and occupant load for collaboration rooms. It was disapproved by the committee by a vote of 9-5 and did not go on for any public comment. I then had a code change for E8 21 that was to change conference room occupant loads to 30 square feet gross. And unfortunately, I had lots of support outside of the committee, but not enough on the committee, and it failed. We took it a public comment and it failed during the public comment as well. And Dave Frable's change was based on the NFPA language with the 450 foot areas, those kind of things. So that's kind of what happened for the 24. So there's no change there. On this change, I have a problem with the footnote because occupant load is not based on occupancy classification. It's based on the function of the space. And I think this footnote would create nothing but confusion for people using this table. Because I get people confused all the time. They go, well, we're going to use the B occupancy. And there is no such thing in the table. It's either business area, and this would then be a subset of the business area, kind of what Dave Grant was saying. So I would be in favor of taking the footnote and deleting that, not including that. If it's an assembly function, that's a whole different world, and that's the 15, 7, and 5. So I would support the deletion of the footnote.
Thanks, Steve. I was also trying to pull it up on my screen. You probably saw my internet pop up, but it sounds like Shauna does have it. So Shauna, I'll let you share your screen since you probably have it quicker than I could have found it.
I think you have to give me permission to do that.
Okay, working on it.
No worries. Yeah, and
you should be able to, Shauna.
it's okay, now I can. Let me see, which do I want? Screen A, IBC Egress, this one, I guess. Hopefully you can see my screen. So what they're talking about is there was a proposal in the beginning. Let me find it. No, that's the wrong one. Oops. Now I just got out of it. See, doing a good job here. There was this proposal in the beginning to look at 7, which is this collaboration room, and it gave a definition of a collaboration room. And what they did was say 30 gross, which would get shot down anyway, but they put a size on it of the 450 feet. And if it's over 450, then you go to the 15. And then Steve had the next proposal, which was a conference room and of 30 gross. And it got shot down. But Steve, the one that got shot down for the collaboration rooms didn't come back. Steve came back on his and changed it. So the original one got shot down, and he came back and changed it and put a square footage on it, right? And then changed it to 30 net. And then if you are bigger than that, then you have to use the assembly occupancy or the assembly occupant load factor. So that is what happened on the national level. Now, what I want to do is to take you back and stop sharing, because I would ask you to look at the current proposal, which I guess, can you put back up there, Kevin? So the current proposal is, based on what I'm hearing, is doing two different things. So you either have to take out that, if you take out the line that David Wren was talking about between concentrated business use areas and then the lobbies and lounges, so that it truly is a business area, then you don't need footnote D, but perhaps to solve your problems, you need a square footage like those other proposals had on there. But if you don't remove the line, and this is something totally different than just business areas, and it applies to any lobbies and lounges, then you do need footnote D. So I think you guys need to clarify your intent on if you truly want it business areas, and if you're worried about the size of it, do you need to put a square footage on there like the other ones did? And so, thank you.
Thank you, Shauna. You definitely pulled that up a lot quicker than I could. Next up is Steve.
So to kind of address, give you an idea, well, give you the reason that it got turned down when we came back with the 750 square feet, is that somebody said, okay, if I've got a 735 square foot conference room, I have an occupant load of 14 or 15. But if it's 755 square feet, it now has an occupant load of 50. It was, the smaller one was 25, and then it jumps to 50, and people had a hard time with that. I tried to just kind of limit it to small conference rooms. In my opinion, all conference rooms should be 30 square feet net, because you've got non-simultaneous use from the users of the office that are also in there, and the 30 square feet takes into account people coming in from outside and those kind of things. But I think I like this change, because I think based on discussions we've had on projects in the city, I think this clarifies that the lobby of a business area, and I would agree with Shauna, we need to take that line out so there's a subset of the business areas. And I mean, to be very honest with you, and I don't think there's probably people that wouldn't agree, I think the lobby of an office space is really the same as the business area and should be at 150 square feet gross. But I know that the plans examiners have not looked at that way, that they look at it as an assembly function. And so if we can get something that's more reasonable like this, it's better than what we currently have.
Next up is David.
I just want to offer a couple thoughts. Looking at the format of the 21 code, I may have confused things with the line. They actually do have lines between that, but the concentrated business use area is indented a bit. So I think we keep the line, but both of these would be indented to indicate that they're really kind of a subset of the business area. So just to clarify that. If we were to go ahead with this, that footnote D would go away for reasons already stated. The There are a couple concerns I have with this is one, it's like Steve, I think there are cases where an office lobby that doesn't have much seating in it, or even a lounge area that, with the different types of office spaces we're seeing someday is really just meant to be a different work area for people that I don't know that I'd always classify those as an assembly use where this is a reduction. Depending on the furniture layout, this might be an increase in occupant load. So you have that concern. And then just, what is a lounge? Or what is a collaboration area? There's no definition. And, I could see a collaborate, we're no longer going to see conference rooms. We're going to see every room labeled as a collaboration room. If we add that in, and all of a sudden we got a 1,500 square foot collaboration room with, half the load we used to have. So without definitions of what those mean, it might create some confusion, I think.
Okay. Next up is Paul.
Yeah, when I first read this, I had some concerns as well. And one of my concerns is this really unique to Denver, and shouldn't this problem be, issue be solved on a national basis? And if we pass this is now one more variation of the occupant load table. We already have one where we have to calculate occupant load two ways, gross and net, take the larger of the two. It's just hard to educate people, especially out of town architects, as to what this really means. And then I think I have some of maybe Dave's practical applications. More and more office spaces that I've seen, the collaboration, quote unquote, is kind of intermingled with cubicles or desks. And yeah, one day it might be 3 team members sitting there talking about a project, or it might be 3 people hoteling from outside the office who are working there that day. Office space is changing pretty rapidly, and it's getting pretty casual and flexible. And, even if you designate an area as a collaboration space, in a month, they might convert it to something else, or they might convert desks to a collaboration space. So it just seems like it's maybe trying to solve a problem that I'm not sure really even exists. I don't know. I wasn't aware that they were already looking at this nationally, but again, they obviously had some issues with it too. So.
Okay, next hand for discussion is Aaron.
Just to sort of agree with the points that were just made, what designates a lobby and a lounge from a business area concentrated is furniture systems. They're furniture systems that aren't really regulated by the code. I think it's absolutely right that this stuff in a modern office tech company is that kind of thing. It's so fluid that I think I understand where the desire to not over restrict, but yeah, it's hard for me to imagine how you define this in a way that doesn't just change almost immediately, which I think is problematic for us to put that into the code.
Okay, any other discussion from the committee? This is your opportunity to make a motion as well. Anybody want to make a motion? Robert, go ahead.
I'd like to make a motion to deny.
Okay, a motion to disapprove.
This is Steve Thomas, second.
Okay, then there's a second. All right, there is a motion to disapprove in a second. So being that we were, let's see, I want to make sure we're still good. Okay, we're good. I'll call a vote. All those in favor of disapproving this proposal, please raise your hand. see hands going up. And Charlie, we'll just make sure that we still have the right number. So I have 11. I'll go ahead and lower them. And all those opposed, please raise your hand. One. Okay, go ahead and lower them. And all those abstaining, please raise your hand. Okay, go ahead and lower. Okay, this was disapproved, 11 to 1 to 1. All right, so now we move to the next item. Note. Okay, next item of business is item number 87. And David, I believe that's yours. I was trying to create a Word document. There was 4 Word documents I didn't have today, and this is another one. So I'm going to try and pull that up in a Word format, but David, go ahead and give us a summary.
David Wren, City of Denver, representing Development Services. This proposal has to do with the number of exits required for egress from stories or occupied roofs. It used to be in the code, there was a specific item that said, essentially all spaces on that story need to have access to all the required exits for the story. Then I think it might have been in 2015, the means of egress got shuffled around quite a bit. And that was inadvertently left out of the code, that language. So now it just says you need these exits, but it doesn't say you actually have to get to them. So what this proposal does is really just brings a proposal that I believe was Mr. Steve Thomas's proposal for the 2024 code. Pulls it ahead 3 years, and then we can take it out in 3 years. That just clarifies that each space needs to have access to the required exits, be it 2 or 3 or 4, based on the occupant load. And if you could scroll to the second page, you can see the real issue here. Without this specific language, I don't know if the image isn't coming through.
I think you'd have to show it in the PDF because it's not showing up correctly.
But essentially what it shows is a floor of the space that, you have 2 tenants divided right down the middle, and they each have a single exit. Both of those tenants maybe qualify as a single exit space. They're less than 50 people. The common path is okay. So you could have this configuration, and really, you could do that in a high-rise configuration for that matter. As tall as you want it. In Denver, we get a lot of office buildings that need 3 exits, and we'll see architects try to say, well, if I take half of it, and has their own exit and then access to an exit in the middle of the building, and that's less than 500 people, I'm good. And then the other half of the building gets access to 2, but no one has access to 3. So we have to argue the intent of the code here instead of the actual words. I'd rather just get it in and have the words in the code instead of having to argue the intent that was inadvertently lost a few cycles ago. That's all I have.
Thanks, David. And sorry about having to switch between PDF and Word there. But we'll turn it over to the general public. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support of this proposal, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support of this proposal, please raise your hand. I see Daniel. Daniel, you'll have 2 minutes.
Similar to the proposal before, this doesn't change how we review projects. It's just a tool to make it clear to people submitting as to what the expectation is. It makes it clear that every space on the story has a requirement of 2 exits. There are potentially some issues that will happen with 3 exit buildings because we have quite a few number of buildings in Denver that are constructed already with 3 exits because of an occupant load of 500, but only some portions have access to 2. Each portion has access to 2, and they don't have access to all three. So we might need to have a grandfather language like we have with scissor stairs at some point. But this is definitely a great clarification. It's what we're already enforcing. And NFPA 101, I was doing some research on comparing our code to that, because in some buildings that are regulated by the state, we need to be coordinated. And it's definitely super clear, as it was in previous iterations of IBC, that the requirement for number of exits from a story is from every portion of the story. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Anybody else from the general public that wants to speak in support of this proposal? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to opposition. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this proposal, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this, please raise your hand. Seeing none, I will go back to the committee. Committee, this is your time for questions. Anybody from the committee has questions, please raise your hand. Any questions from the committee? Third and final call, questions from the committee. Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious about just describing a little more about how this is being a carry forward from the future, from the coming code. Do I understand this is past committee? This is absolutely coming just exactly as it's written here. We're not doing anything other than just bringing forward what is already coming. Is that? I think that's what I heard, but I just want to make sure that's right.
Yes,
That's correct.
This proposal was submitted by Steve Thomas on behalf of the Colorado chapter of ICC. It was heard. It will be in the 2024 exactly how you see it here. It was approved 12-1 in committee and went uncontested, so no public comments or anything. So this is exactly how you'll see it in the 2024.
Okay, thank you.
Next hand is Steve.
I'm going to make a motion to approve as submitted.
Hey, Steve, hold tight. We're in the question period.
Oh, I'm sorry. You got to have yourself. Sorry.
No worries. Let's see. Any other questions? Third and final call for questions. Seeing no other questions from the committee. I do see. Oh, sorry, Steve. I know what you're going to do. Not quite yet. We do have to go back to the general public for rebuttal since someone did speak up. Anybody from the general public that wants to rebuttal and support, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to rebuttal and support, please raise your hand. Third and final call. Anybody from the general public that wants to rebuttal and support, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none. Now, Steve, if you want to raise your hand and make a motion, go for it.
All right, I'll make a motion to approve as submitted.
Okay, great. So there's a motion to approve as submitted. Robert, your hand's up next.
I second.
Okay, so there's a motion to approve with a second. Any other discussion? Any other discussion from the committee? Okay, seeing none, I will call a vote then. The vote is to approve as submitted. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And I see hands going up. Okay, 12, go ahead and lower them. All those opposed, please raise your hand. 0, and all those abstaining, please raise your hand. 0. Okay, so this proposal passes. Hey, and I didn't even have to modify it in a Word document. That's great. All right, so let me close out of that one. And that brings us to item P6, which is Jessica. Jessica, give me 1 second while I mute you. Hey, Jessica, you should be allowed to talk. You can give us a summary on your proposal. Please introduce where you're from first, and then I'll pull up your proposal.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, I'm Jessica McQuinn. I'm an architectural reviewer with the City and County of Denver. I'm submitting this proposal on behalf of myself to address converging egress paths. So in 2016, Denver Building Code Amendments, as you might remember, we had a section, an amendment that was, I believe, proposed by Brad Emmerich, who was with the fire department at the time. And that amendment addressed diverging egress paths from the terminus of the common path of travel. The intent of that section was to make sure that, once two exits are required from a space, those egress paths don't converge. And in 2018, I was actually the proponent who suggested that we get rid of that amendment. And that was based on the justification that IBC 1007.1.1 already addresses this concept. It says where two exit access doorways are required from any portion of the exit access, they shall be separated per this section. So in trying to delete that amendment, I made this argument, and that proposal was pushed through with the block vote, Denver's block vote in 2018, and that amendment was deleted from the 2019 DBCA. So it turns out we don't actually all agree that 1007.1.1 addresses exit path convergence. One of the counter arguments is that, a space is not defined. And so as long as you provide an two exit access doorways from, say, an office suite into a corridor, then you have met the intent of this section, and common path no longer applies, and exit separation no longer applies. So I don't know if you can kind of scroll down to the images, or do I have control, or you got it? Okay. So I'll just point out while we're talking about this. Also, I don't know if at some point we can pull up the commentary image that goes along with 100621, but there's an image that basically shows common path does not stop at an exit access doorway into a corridor. It continues to be measured in the corridor. So I think my interpretation here is consistent with the commentary. I think that a lot of the reviewers with DFD and the architectural reviewers at the city agree with this interpretation. And really, I don't necessarily know that it even needs to be codified, except that I come from a place of just wanting to provide consistency. It wasn't that long ago that I was in the design industry, and I felt like if I knew what the expectations were of me from the get-go, it was a lot easier than just not being sure, or just dealing with inconsistency and then having to redesign multiple months down the road. So just trying to make this as clear as possible. So if you can scroll up a little bit on the images. So I guess this graphic one is kind of an example of what we see. Or there's an argument that, two exit access doorways have been provided from that space. And so the intent of 100621 has been met, and there's literally nothing that would address the egress path convergence, except maybe, really the only other section I can think of that would then regulate this space would be, the distribution of minimum width and required capacity in 1005.5. So again, I think that this concept is, many people have this interpretation already, and some might argue that it doesn't need to be codified, but it's just coming from a place of trying to provide consistency.
Okay, thanks for the summary, Jessica. We will turn it to the general public for anybody that wants to speak in support of this proposal. Please raise your hand. A few hands going up. First hand is Brad. Brad, please introduce yourself, and you'll have 2 minutes to speak in support.
Hi, Brad Emmerich. I'm an architectural engineer specialist with the community planning and development, speaking on my own behalf. Can you guys hear me, I hope?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thank you. So I just wanted to speak in support of this. I mean, it's been long in the code that when two exits are provided, that they have to be separated. We had to do some special things back in the 90s, actually in the 80s, to accommodate scissor stairs and smaller footprint floor plates in buildings. But the intent is that once you establish a separation for 50 or more people, those people are supposed to be provided with that separation until they get into, nowadays, until they get into the exit system. And so, as Jessica was pointing out just a minute ago, the corridor is specifically defined as being part of the exit access. Common path of travel is specifically defined as being measured in the exit access portion of the system. And so once you get into a corridor, the separation, the protection given to the general public by the separation should not be removed, as it would be if you got into the exit portion of the system. And so the basic intent is that this is a quote, I think, from Steve Thomas or his group, that the code is willing to sacrifice 49 people, but once you get to 50, they need to be protected. And so the intent is that one single fire event should not block the egress path of the 50 or more occupants that are trying to get out of the building. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brad. Next up is Daniel. You'll have 2 minutes.
Like the previous two proposals, this is to help the applicant and the designer. Or at least most of us, review this way, and that's been language previously in the code. I want to quote for a moment from the NFPA 101, just because when I'm in doubt, it helps me. It has similar language, even though it is a different code. 14.254, every room or space with an occupant load more than 50 persons shall comply with the following. It has items 1, 2, and 3. Item 1 is the room or space shall have a minimum of 2 exit access doors. Number 2, the doors shall provide access to separate exits. Number 3, the doors required by this section shall be permitted to open onto a common corridor, provided that such corridor leads to separate exits located in opposite directions. So to think that you would exit from separated doors and then converge is clearly, that's not allowed. There was similar language in IBC, as Brad mentioned. It was just kind of lost over time, and it was assumed that convergence is an issue, and that's how we enforce the code regardless. And I don't think whether this is adopted or not is going to change that for most of us, as far as I'm familiar. I also want to point to 1006.33, single exits in the IBC. 1006.3.3, item 2 allows a story on the level of exit discharge to have a single exit, but only when the room area of space complies with the table, and the exits are directly to the exterior. So that means that those doors don't go into a corridor and converge, or get closer to each other or whatnot. So it's clear if you look at single exits in contrast to where we're saying 2 exits are required. It says single exits can happen, but only when the room complies with 1006.21, meaning it has less than 50 occupants. If it had 50 occupants and you had convergence, you wouldn't be able to, it wouldn't be allowed. So to me, 1006.33, item 2 makes it clear that when it says single exits, it tells you what is allowed, and clearly this isn't allowed as a single exit, so it would have to be,
okay, Daniel, I'm gonna have to cut you off. I'm sorry. Your 2 minutes is up. Thank you, though, for that. You will have an opportunity again to have a rebuttal here, so keep that up. Any other people from the general public that wants to speak in support of this proposal? Third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support? Seeing none, we'll go to opposition. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, we go over to the committee now for questions. Shauna, I see your hand up first.
Well, I do have a question of the proponent, I'm guessing, on your exception number 3, where it says, where exits from the story are separated a distance less than what story? I mean, like, none of this is talking about story. It does say including individual building stories. So I'm just wondering if that should be where exits from a story are separated or something. I just don't. I just want to make sure I'm not missing something, or if it should say where.
Jessica, go ahead. Feel free to unmute Jessica.
Where exits from an individual building story is separated. I'm just trying to make it tie in. I'm sorry, I have the code in front of me. Trying to make it tie into 1007.1 that says exit access doorways and exit access stairways and ramps serving spaces, including individual building stories, shall be separated. So I'm just wondering if that should either say a story or from individual building stories.
Yeah, I don't see that. I think it'd be fine to change it to where exits from a story are separated a distance less than is required. This is obviously to address buildings that might have, scissor stairs or stairs that do not meet the separation required for the space.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Steve, go ahead.
So you're talking about paths, but you put this in the section that talks about the separation between exits, exit access doorways, exit access stairways, and ramps. Why did you put it here and not in 1006 that deals with common path of travel?
I didn't want to have to reiterate what separation distance was required. But I think this would work just as well saying the required separation distance between exits or exit access doorways shall be maintained until an exit is reached. So removing path altogether.
So would this apply to the exit discharge door?
You're saying once they've hit the exit discharge, if they're in the exit discharge and the path converges, no, it would not apply once you're in an exit or exit discharge.
Okay, but it says that between the distinct egress paths till you get to an exit, okay? All right, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Shauna, I see your hand still up. I assume that just going to dig down. So any other questions from the committee? Third and final call. Any other questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, I'll go back to the general public for rebuttals. Anybody from the general public that wants to rebut in support, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in rebuttal of this, please raise your hand. Third and final call, any rebuttals in support from the general public? I do see Daniel. Daniel, you'll have 1 minute. Go ahead.
I'm not able to find it right now, but when I was looking at NFPA 101, it did have some tools we might want to look at if anyone has an issue with this language, because it's just super clear. It says any portion of the exit access has to be separated, the 1/3 or 1/2. So any portion of the exit access as opposed to the exit access doorway is helpful in avoiding this confusion and kind of achieves the same thing as what Jessica's trying to achieve. So if anyone's looking for other options to achieve the same thing, but I think this proposal works just as well. But NFPA 101 does just say any portion of the exit access, that works too. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Third and final call, I guess fourth call, since we did have one other person. That's wants the rebuttal in support. Please raise your hand. Okay, since we didn't have anybody speak in opposition from the public, we turn it back over to the committee. Committee, this is now your time for discussion or to make a motion. Any discussions or motions? Paul, go ahead. Paul, you are muted.
Oh, duh. I just want to say I'm in support of this. I do a lot of plan review at my firm, and I come across this all the time. People have these situations and they say, why can't I do this? And I have a hard time pointing the code where it specifically says it, but all I can point to is there's a diagram in the commentary that points to this. And half the time I end up saying, just trust me, you can't do it. So I think clarification would be great.
Okay, next hand goes with David.
Yeah, I just have a few thoughts. One, just to address what Paul said, I think he's referring to a diagram in the commentary that shows, well, maybe not, that shows you going from one room into another room. And then those two combined rooms have to have a separated, essentially a new diagonal and separated. That's a little different because you're egressing through another room as opposed to going into the corridor. So it's not quite the same, but just a couple more comments. One, the way this is worded, I have concerns with. It talks about the required separation distance between distinct egress paths. I don't believe anywhere in the code it requires I don't think it requires a distinct egress path, let alone a separation distance between those paths. There's a requirement for the doors, exit access doors, but not the paths. So just the wording doesn't quite work for me. And then just I'm not taking an opinion on this next thing, but just a little commentary from the commentary. For 1006.2 for egress from spaces, that would kick you into having the two exits. It says this section dictates the minimum number of paths of travel an occupant is to have available to avoid a fire incident in the occupied room or space. So you're in a room, you have more than 50 people, you need two exits. The idea is, the fire is within that space, blocks one of the exits, so you can get out the other way. So now you have all 50 people or more going out one of those doors. Do we really need two choices again for a fire that's out in the corridor? I'm not sure. And that's my thoughts on that. Although one thing I will say though, if we do approve it, quite honestly, it's it's conservative. It won't, so it won't cause any issues, I don't think, other than layout gets tough sometimes.
All right, next up is Steve.
Dave brings up a really good, interesting point, because the required separation between the paths, how do I measure that? Is it to the center of the path, to the closest point of the path, the farthest path? There's not enough direction there. Exception number 3, I've read about 80 times while people have testified, and I still don't understand what it says. It's very confusing to me, and I'm sorry if it's confusing to me. I guarantee it's going to be confusing to folks that need to design according to this. And then my third opposition is that I don't think it's in the right place. I think it needs to be in 1006.2, where we talk about common path of travel and those paths.
Okay. Any other discussions from the committee? Discussion or make a motion? Anybody want to make a motion? Anybody from the committee have anything else to say? Steve, go ahead.
I'll jump in, get us going. Make a motion for disapproval.
Okay, there's a motion for disapproval. Any other discussion, or does someone want to second that? Robert, go ahead.
I'll second that.
Okay, there's a motion to disapprove and a second. Anybody want to have discussion? Any committee members want to have final discussion on this? Seeing none, I will call a vote then. The vote is to disapprove this proposal. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And still moving. Okay. Okay, final call is 9. Go ahead and lower your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. Go ahead and lower your hands. And all those abstaining, please raise your hand. I have 2. Okay, go ahead and lower your hand. So this proposal was disapproved. So let's, we got time for one more. I don't like to start unless we have at least 10-15 minutes on the next one. And it looks like we do. So let's pull up the next item, which, Tony, I believe that's yours, number 15.
Good afternoon, everybody. Tony Carl, representing Denver Fire Department. And the intent of this code change is to coordinate codes specifically for lobbies serving accessible elevators. And I may need to change the wording to account for that. But essentially right now, the ASME elevator code requires that elevator lobbies and elevator sills be illuminated at 100-foot candles for the duration of the emergency power, which is typically 2-hour standby power. However, we often see egress illumination using 90-minute battery packs because that's allowed by this section. So typically elevator inspectors have been making this comment in the city for accessible elevators. So again, the intent is to coordinate 2-hour emergency power or standby power for accessible elevators with illumination standby power. So they're both 2-hour requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. We'll turn it over to the general public. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support of this, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support of this, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support of this, please raise your hand. Seeing none, I'll move to opposition. Anybody that wants to speak in opposition of this from the general public, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Seeing none, I'll turn it back to the committee. Committee, this is your time for questions. Any committee members have questions? Please raise your hand. Steve, go ahead.
Tony, I have a couple of questions. Number one, you mentioned in your testimony that this is intended to apply to accessible means of egress elevators. Is that correct?
That is correct. So I would be modifying the language to account for that.
And what would you suggest?
Maybe starting off the sentence with for accessible elevators.
Okay, and then the next question is it just says a means of egress illumination, which under the code is your normal power. Is it your intent that it's just the normal power that would have to stay on for 2 hours, or is it your intent to apply this to emergency powered illumination?
Yeah, that is correct. It would be standby power.
All right, great, thanks.
Next question comes from David.
Yeah, Tony, I mean, I see where you're going with this to coordinate with the elevator codes. But I'm struggling a little bit that this is it gives a duration for emergency power for these lobbies. I can't find anywhere in 1008.3 that requires emergency power for these lobbies. The elevators, accessible means of egress elevators do, but I can't find anything that requires the lobby to even have the emergency power. So I don't know if you can point me to that or clarify that a bit.
Can I share my screen, Kevin?
Yeah. I think, Dave, that
Yeah,
would
go
be
right
the
ahead.
general means of egress, illumination requirements.
But where does it
Shauna,
say?
you can share, there you go.
This is what he's talking about. So in 1008.3, it asked for emergency power, and this was going to be my comments as well. Nowhere in here does it say that you have to have backup power or egress illumination power supply for elevators. It has aisles, corridors, and exits in the buildings, exit access, exit stairways, passageways, and then in rooms and spaces, the equipment room, blah, blah, blah. So nowhere does it say it that elevator lobby requires it. That's what you're saying, David, right? And so you're adding this as a new subsection 108.3.4.1. Another problem is that 108.3.4 has all the requirements, but your proposal just says it has to have power. It doesn't give any requirements. In your testimony, you said 100-foot candle for the duration of the emergency power. You gave more specifics in your testimony than you put in the language. So maybe would you be okay with an amendment that takes it out of 108.3.4.1 and just adds somehow, it in here so that you have all this other language about how it has to work, and that already talks about the emergency power and not just the power, because yours does say just the power only has to be on for 2 hours. So it's maybe finding a way to combine it in here or to expand on yours so that it really says what you want it to say.
Yeah, definitely open to that, Shauna.
I can stop sharing, sorry.
Okay, David, did that help answer your question that you had then as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen again. All right. Any other questions from the committee at this time? Any other questions from the committee? Okay. None. And there was nobody that spoke from the general public. We will open it up for discussion. Committee members, this is your time to have discussion or make a motion. Anybody from the committee wants to say anything?
So I was just going to point out, I think section 1008.3 is already emergency power for illumination. So I think this section already falls under that. So I don't know if there's a need to restate that it's emergency power.
Okay. Shauna, I'll let you look into that since you're the subject matter expert. And if you want to weigh in a little bit later, you can, but we got a couple other hands up. Steve, go ahead.
Okay, I like what you're trying to do, Tony. I hate to do this, but I'm going to try to fix it for you. It's probably easier just to disapprove, but I think it needs to be addressed because it definitely is an issue. So if you look at what I've done in chat, forget about the first bubble. So I would recommend I don't want to make a motion yet. I just want to get discussion. So we would then add an item to 1008.3.3. It would be item 6 that would say elevator lobby serving accessible means of egress elevators, period. Okay, so that would address what Shauna was just talking about, that we need somewhere that says I got to have emergency powered illumination in that lobby. And then what I would do is 1008.3.4 is the duration requirement that says, okay, you can do 90 minutes. And what I would recommend is that we add an exception. And this was written really quick, so I'm proofreading it right now. The means of egress illumination, elevator lobby serving as the accessible means of egress elevator, it should say, shall be provided with, and that should say emergency power for a duration of not less than 2 hours. So a long suggested, probably ruled out of order by the chair.
But no, that's absolutely fine. We're at the time where you can make a motion. So Steve, if that's a motion to modify, you can do that.
Steve, I would agree with that. How about, can we add corridor in addition to elevator lobbies? Because sometimes they open right into a corridor without a lobby.
I think that really muddies it, because now how far down the corridor do I have to do it? I think we know what a lobby is, and you're going to have a lobby anyway if you've got an accessible means of egress, because you've got to have an area of refuge.
Yeah. Oh. I wonder, Kevin, if I can share my screen and we can look at the actual provision in the elevator code.
Go ahead. You should be able to now, Steve or Tony.
Yeah, not seeing it. Yeah, I'm not seeing it, Kevin.
You're not seeing the availability to share your screen?
Correct.
Across the bottom of your box there, where right next to where you raise your hand, there's a thing that says share screen.
Here we go. Can everybody see that section? Illumination at landing sills.
Yes.
That says it has to have illumination. I don't see where it says anything about emergency powered illumination.
Well, it says when the elevator is in service.
Well, that's at all times. So that's the base requirement, that you have to have lighting at the sill.
Correct, whether you're on normal power or standby power, correct?
Right, so that's not emergency power.
Well, I think the code's what dictates the emergency power. But I think that what's implied is, as long as that elevator's in service, you have to have illuminated sills.
So you're saying whether it's in service because under normal power or whether it's in service under backup power, it has to have that illumination.
Correct.
Okay, so just to keep things moving, Steve, you did have commentary, but you didn't quite make a motion, so that is absolutely fine too. But I'm going to move on to the next person then that has their hand, because we have several hands up. David, you're up next.
Thank you, Steve. I was right with you all the way there and was ready to second the motion. Tony, I hear what you're saying about the corridors. That's where I backed away. I see what you mean about at the sill. I was picturing a person needing that egress, making it to the elevator lobby, within the 90 minutes that are, is provided in the corridor, and then they had an extra half hour there at the elevator lobby at the sill, and that made a lot of sense to me, to separate those two apart. So I would have seconded the motion if Steve had made it.
Okay.
I still may make it. I just want to see what other people say.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's perfectly fine to do. That's the point of this section. So any other discussions? If there's no other discussions, I mean, feel free, Steve, to go ahead, even if there are other discussions, but it doesn't look like any other hands are going up.
Right, so I'm
we
gonna
got
make.
a couple more, we had
Oops,
a couple more go up. David R, it's David, the other David, so.
Yeah, I
go
think,
ahead.
Steve, I think, what you're proposing, solves my main issue that the building code didn't require it in the first place. I'm still, I have a little pause on the lobbies still. You had mentioned there'd be an area of refuge. There are lots of exceptions in the code to area of refuge, and to be honest, I hardly ever see it put in. As soon as the building's sprinklered, you don't need the area of refuge. So often they will open into a corridor. And if it's just opening into a corridor, I don't know that the term lobbies captures it.
Okay, I just put in, that's why I didn't want to make a motion to see what people thought. So I just put in a new one in chat that says, and I stole this from the 1009 accessible means of egress. So it says the exception is the means of egress illumination at elevator landings serving an accessible means of egress elevator shall be provided with emergency powered illumination for a duration of not less than 2 hours.
I like that.
So that's consistent with the communication requirement, the two-way communication.
But still keeping your first one to 10833.
Yes. So it'd be a two-part modification. So the first part would be to add, and we need to change that to say, let me get that copied so that it's easier on you guys to put in. Elevator landings serving accessible means of egress elevators. That work?
And where is that going?
So that would go into 1008 point, gotta get back to it, sorry.
3.3.
Point, it's the one that's rooms and spaces. So 1008.3.3. Where currently you have to have it at electrical rooms, fire command centers, fire pump rooms, generators, and public restrooms over 300 square feet. You've got scoping, and then you got the exception that says, okay, it's got to go for 2 hours. Does that address your question, Tony, about the corridors?
Yep, 100%. Thanks for the help.
Yep.
Okay, I'm trying to prepare because this is another one that I didn't have a Word document for, and so it's going to be kind of funky. But we do have another hand up. Aaron, go ahead.
The duration that's listed in the code, in the building code, and every place that I'm aware of is for 90-minute. When you look for fixtures, for emergency backup lighting fixtures, they're quite economical at 90 minutes. As soon as you go to 2 hours, they're sort of like car batteries with, lights attached. It's much more of a custom specialty item, far less readily available. They're out there. But given that we've basically added the requirement for this in here, I'm just wondering what the opinion would be of people to say, could it be 90 minutes? Could we go with the type of fixtures that we're using everywhere else, as it's written to require 2 hours? As best I understand, it would be requiring a one-off fixture for just this location. Yeah, I guess I don't know what my question is in that, but I guess, and first of all, is there another place where 2 hours is required? And secondly, is there a reason that we couldn't move this to 90 minutes to be consistent with other fixtures on the project?
They have to go,
Anybody
but I
want-
think high rise requires 2 hours in some areas. I'm starting to question whether with the ASME's intent is that applies under emergency powered conditions as well. When reading that, I think it's intended to mean under normal operations of the building. It's not intended to go that way, but I'm not an elevator inspector or expert on that. I mean, I think you could read it that way and make that interpretation, but I'm not sure that's a correct interpretation, if that makes sense.
David, and that is what we've seen in the past is contractors upgrading to a 2-hour power supply or hooking up to the 2-hour powered generator that's already been provided to run the elevator.
Well, that's a good point. If you got an excessive means of egress elevator, you are gonna have a generator unless they use the horizontal exit exception.
Okay, no more hands up. Steve, you want to make your motion?
All right, sure, let's see. So, do you want it as 2 modifications or just one big one?
You can tell me them both, but we will vote on them together if you would like. It sounds like the committee is okay with both of those. So if you thought that the committee wasn't okay with one, then I would say let's do them separately. But I think I've captured them on the screen if you wanted to make that motion.
All right, so let me see what you got on the screen here. So 1008.33. So I make a motion to modify the proposal to add elevator landing serving as accessible means of egress as item 6 to section 1008.3.3. And then further adding an exception to 1008.3.4.1 that says the means of egress illumination and elevator landings serving an accessible means of egress elevator shall be provided with emergency powered illumination for a duration of not less than 2 hours.
Okay, great. I do see a hand up. Juan, go ahead. Juan, you are on mute. You're still on mute. There you go.
I second the motion.
Okay, great. There is a motion and a second. Any other discussion or anything else? Okay. Seeing none, I'll call it. Go ahead, David.
Sorry, I just thought of one thing. I don't think Steve mentioned it in his motion. Delete the section that Tony had proposed.
That's correct. So we replaced the proposal with that language.
Just so we're clear.
No, you're right. Good call.
That is a very good call there. Okay. All right, so I will call a vote, hearing that there is no more discussion on this. All those in favor of, we're just voting on the motions now. That's it. We're not voting on the proposal, just the motion to amend here, these 2 amendments. All those in favor of approving those amendments, please raise your hand. I see 12, go ahead and lower. All those opposed, please raise your hand. 0, all those abstaining, please raise your hand. 1, okay, go ahead and lower your hands. So that's for the amendment to the proposal. So now If there's a motion to approve as written, let's hear that. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but I would assume that's the next course there, logical course there. David, go ahead. David T.
So moved.
Okay.
Second.
Julie?
Second.
Okay. I see no other discussion. All those in favor of approving as amended, please raise your hand. Okay, go ahead and lower your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. 0. All those, sorry, there's 1. All those abstaining, please raise your hand. And 0. Okay. Steve, do you have a question? Okay, so the proposal passes with the amendments as modified on the screen. Very good, thank you all. We are just over our time for the day. I want to thank you all for joining us. I will stop the recording. I will stay on the line if anybody from the general public or the committee has anything they want to add to us, but we are therefore over. There won't be any more discussion on the items unless it's just for kind of chatting out loud. But thanks everybody for your time. I appreciate it.
Hey, Kevin, what was the vote? What was the tally on the last proposal?
The for the approval was 12 to 1 to 0.
Thank you.
Recording, but yeah, thanks everybody. Have a good evening. Otherwise, I'll stay on the line for a few more minutes.